Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Cap Times Idea Fest. I'm Chris Murphy. I'm the audience director of the Cap Times. Thanks so much for coming tonight. Really appreciate it. In just a few minutes, I'm going to turn things over to our moderator tonight, Allison Garfield, but there are a few important things I need to take care of first. One big important one is to say thanks to the Barrymore, where we are tonight. This is a great space, Madison institution. Please give them a big round of applause. Thank you. I want to make sure that all of you know about other Cap Times Idea Fest events that are coming up this week. We're halfway through, but there's still another dozen sessions to go with some amazing speakers, including Heather Cox Richardson, Liz Cheney, Judy Collins, and many others. Some of you have tickets to see those sessions already, but some of you don't. And for those of you who don't, I want to make sure you know that general admission tickets are back on sale. And so you can go and find out about what's still remaining and find out about tickets at captimesideafest.com. Need to spend a few more minutes on one important thing, which is to thank our sponsors, without which we could not do this festival. Tonight's session is being sponsored by the Madison Community Foundation, but there are many others as well. Yes, please give them a round of applause. Those of you who were here before, you'll hear the same ones again, but I'll go through quick, I promise. Our presenting sponsor is Epic, and there are also HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, UW Health's Carbone Cancer Center, MGE, Ascendium, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, University Research Park, the Century House, Overture Center for the Arts, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, the Madison Community Foundation, did that one, Cargo Coffee, the La Follette School of Public Affairs, Forward Theater, Leopold's Books Bar Cafe, Madison College, the Wisconsin Historical Society, the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, and Civic Media. We appreciate all of them. About tonight's session on housing prices, Allie has questions prepared for the panel, but there are ways that you can ask questions too. Hopefully you all picked up comment cards when you came in, and you can fill out questions on those, and either I or one of my associates will be around in about half hour, 40 minutes to pick those up, and I'll bring them up here to the stage. And Allie will do her best to work them in with the time we've got. Can't guarantee that we'll get all the questions in, but we'll do the best that we can. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Allie, who has been covering local government for us for the past 3 years. And a lot of what she's written about this past year has been about housing. So please give her a warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a Wednesday. Hopefully some folks stuck around from the beer panel, are feeling nice and loose, calling out questions. No, don't do that. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Welcome to Cap Times Idea Fest, and welcome to our housing panel, where we are aiming to answer one question really tonight that's on everyone's minds lately. How can we afford to live in Madison? Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, but for those who don't know me, my name is Allie, and I cover local government at the Cap Times, and I'm really happy to be here talking about the housing crisis with these folks here. I've spent the past few years digging into lots of aspects of housing, from zoning to new developments to homelessness and rising rents. And now we've got 4 panelists here who we've got community leaders, experts, just about every perspective you can think of to break down these growing pains and what, if any, solutions are available. So over to my right, we've got Joe Bernard, a planning project manager for the city of Minneapolis, who has been involved in the city's land use planning, transportation planning, and development regulations since 2006. Joe served as the co-project manager for the Minneapolis 2040 growth plan, and recently worked to rewrite the city's zoning ordinance. And next over here, we have Alder Amani Latimer Burris, who was elected to Madison City Council in 2023 to represent District 12. Outside of city government, Alder Amani has worked in research and advising, policy development, and issues advocacy for the National Urban League, the NAACP, and the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Over to my left, we've got Ian Carter, a real estate agent for Keller Williams Realty in Madison. And Ian also works as the co-director for Own It, Building Black Wealth, a program designed to eliminate barriers to wealth and home ownership for Black families in the Madison area. And last but not least, we've got Bill Connors, the executive director of Smart Growth Greater Madison, an organization that advocates at the local government level for policies that increase the housing supply and take costs out of housing development. Connors is also a former Sun Prairie City Council president and former city administrator. So thank you all for being here, and thank you all for being here. I've got a lot of questions. I'm sure some of you guys have some questions. So let's dive right on in. Yeah, I guess as a quick primer for anyone in the audience just getting up to speed on Madison's housing market and the situation, the city is expected to add over 100,000 new residents between now and 2050. Housing experts project that the community will need at least 7,000 new units a year to keep up. But the development of new housing, specifically affordable housing, has not matched that pace or the demand. So we're seeing rent prices go up and we're seeing housing prices go up. With the rising cost of housing top of mind for both Madison renters and homeowners, what can the city do to ease the burden on residents? Let's throw this one over to Ian here.
That's probably the million-dollar question or the multi-million-dollar question at this point. The question that's on a lot of people's mind. And I don't know that there's a clear answer that's going to come immediately to a resolution. I think there's a process that has to happen, and it has to start with the city being open and transparent, open to feedback, open to figuring out what solutions that are in place are currently working for residents as well as renters, and then what is happening system-wise that really is an impediment, that is not making things easier. But at the same time, they have to keep in mind that there are property owners and individuals who own properties as investments. So you don't want to alienate anybody, and that's what makes it extremely difficult. So like I say, staying transparent, making sure that they're at the table and having all stakeholders and people that's impacted at the table, and then removing as many barriers and restrictions as possible, whether it's allowing more development on existing properties, whether it's allowing alternative ways to raise revenue to pay for some of the city's costs, as opposed to just putting it all on the taxpayers or the homeowners. But it's just really coming to the table, being open and transparent, and having those conversations.
Anyone else? Joe, you want to chime in?
Yeah, before I offer some thoughts, I just want to share that when we're asked to talk about what we've done in Minneapolis, make clear that this is what has worked for us and this is what we did. We don't mean to assume that this is what's going to work in your community or that it's appropriate for what you are working on. But I think there are some things that translate widely to most communities. Something that we make clear about our work in Minneapolis is that we centered our entire planning process when we developed Minneapolis 2040 on achieving racial equity. Housing affordability is a race equity issue, and if you aren't talking about it in those terms, you're probably going to miss the mark. We've got 100+ years of history and reasons why it's a race equity issue, from redlining to even within the last 10 years, predatory lending practices that have harmed our Black and Indigenous communities. So our work was centered there in talking about when you address housing affordability, you have to talk about for whom, because that changes who is in the room, who needs to be in the room for those conversations, and you need to be clear about who's going to have influence and power and access to to make those changes with your elected leaders, and who's going to benefit from those changes on the ground once you change your policies or regulations about development. So we'll probably get into more details about that later, but that's kind of the starting point for me.
Absolutely. So there have been some steps that we've seen the city take in the past, really decade. But if we kind of focus in on the past few years, leaders have slowly, incrementally changed zoning regulations to allow for more density along major transit routes. They've allowed for more creation of additional dwelling units on different kinds of properties, changed the definition of family in city codes to allow for more people living in rentals. And even just a few weeks ago, the city council passed a new policy allowing developers to add stories to new developments in downtown Madison. I guess I'm curious what you think over here, Alder Amani. What is your opinion on the steps the city has taken so far to address this housing crunch, and what more needs to be done?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And I'm new on council, so of course I don't have all the answers, but I did work as Soglin's campaign aide, and I remember sitting in a room and they were having this really deep intellectual conversation going over economics, and it came out that we were 10,000 units short at any given time. And this has not been true just with the new leadership, but it's been back under his leadership as well. And so I think that, I can sit and list things that have worked. Obviously the tax credits have changed the game. The administration learned, decade ago or more about how to really leverage that and make a difference there. Also, all of the things that you mentioned, us doing, the ADUs, and I'm trying to do partnerships with creating more housing. Those alternative things, we have to educate the consumers about the time it's going to take, and how those work, because they don't add in a lot to our inventory. But the bottom line is, I think as a city, we have to figure out how we're going to spend money, because it's either going to go to one entity, another entity, or another entity, and that's what we're talking about with housing, is how do we do the short term, the medium term, the long term? How do we not have people on the street able to own a home and also appease the developers? And I think that's the mix that we're in.
Yeah. Speaking of developers, Bill, what's your take on this?
Yeah, well, it's encouraging that the city has taken steps in the right direction, but I would call them baby steps in the right direction. They're really very small, incremental kind of changes, and to deal with the fundamental problem we're dealing with in the housing market in the Madison area, we need a bolder action than that. To really create an environment where we can start to produce the amount of housing that we need. Because fundamentally, the problem is, as Alder Amani mentioned, it's been for a long time, the population has been growing because the Madison area is the economic engine of Wisconsin, and people have been coming from all over to take new jobs that are being created, but we're not creating housing units at nearly the pace that the number of jobs is increasing. We are clearly building more housing. We're adding, but we're not adding fast enough. And so we really need policies that allow for it to be very predictable and allow for maximizing the number of units that you can do in the best locations for more housing. And the reason why I talk about the best location for more housing, because if we're going to talk about housing that's affordable to people, say, making 60% of area median income or 30% of area median income, the most affordable housing is the housing that already exists. It's kind of older housing stock. That's what's the most reasonably priced housing. We want to be addressing the huge imbalance between supply and demand that's existed historically in this area, in areas where there is not already that moderate priced housing, so that we're not gentrifying neighborhoods. So the best place to put housing is where you're taking out an old strip mall that really is, you know, vacant much of the time, or old industrial sites that are no longer being used for that purpose because there aren't already housing units there. And so what we want to do is have policies that allow us to maximize the number of units that are going there where you're not replacing existing housing units, because there's a finite number of those parcels. And when those are gone, now you're going to be starting to replace those more affordable older housing units with these brand new fancy expensive housing units. And the longer we can put that off, the better.
If I could add, I think in addition to that, and I agree wholly with what you're saying, I think in addition to that, we also need to invest in the workforce. I know we talk a lot about workforce housing, those who are working in these communities having a place to live, but additionally, we need to talk about those who are actually building these buildings that are in this community. Right now, we're at about a 5,000 unit deficit annually in our county. So we're about 2,000 units. We need to be closer to about 7,000. But a big problem that we have is we don't necessarily have the workforce to sustain this level of building. If you notice around the city, you'll see a lot of the same names, and a lot of those same builders have a lot of the same, loyal, good workers. But in terms of recruiting new people to the field and getting them trained and leveled up in order to be able to go out and produce at the level they need to on these job sites, it's just not up to the level that we need, and that's something that needs to be addressed as well.
And if I could just add on to that, talking about the number of units that are needed, you're coming from workforce development, you're coming from the developer's position. We can't forget we went through the Great Recession in 2008. I mean, that wiped the city down, and it wipes down all the things that add into housing, such as the construction costs, such as, people just recovering. We can go down the list. We all have read them. People know them. People went through the Great Recession. So I think that sometimes the narrative gets spun that we just underbuilt, hey, we were Madison and we just weren't going to do anything. We're just going to sit back. But in fact, we went off the cliff with the Great Recession. I know, because I personally was in development, condo conversions, and I lost $4.5 million worth of property. I went straight from being a developer to literally living in Super 8. So I got a full spectrum there. And so I think it's natural that we're behind. And then COVID-19 hit.
Definitely. When you talk about, the workforce, it's also important to note, one of the things that I find so interesting about writing about housing is it connects to everything, to local government, to the economy, and you have to talk about making sure that you're paying folks who are doing that work enough to be able to live here, right? It's all very interconnected, and it's all incredibly personal to people, which is, I think, what we have seen here in Madison, what you're seeing across the country, I'm sure in Minneapolis as well. People feel really strongly about this topic here, right? And where housing should go, and what Madison should look like as the population grows. So I guess, we've seen that play out in a heated debate here. And my question is, how should residents engage in this conversation? And is it possible to do so without creating a divide between one side or another, between devolving to language like NIMBY and YIMBY and all of that fun stuff?
I'd like to jump in on this one. Yeah, so this is partly why I became a planning professional. I love community engagement and figuring out these problems with stakeholders. Something that we did at the beginning of, now I'm taking kind of a step back here, you can talk about the actual, action steps and solutions to these problems, but I think if you don't get everyone on the same page from the beginning, it makes it so much harder to implement things on the back end. And so we spent tons of resources in Minneapolis doing engagement. And where we started from is we had an engagement plan that we had our city council adopt and direct us to enforce, where we said very directly, we're not going to spend city resources engaging with white single-family homeowners. And the reason for that is that they have access and agency. Remember what I was talking about before. They're going to show up and tell us what they think no matter what. So let's spend our resources bringing other folks to the table who don't have that access and agency. And so this is part of where coalition building starts, is that you bring diverse voices to the table and understand how the issues are affecting them and raise those issues up. So what we did next was adopt a series of goals for our plan. Have the city council adopt those. This is before talking about any details about what we're actually going to do. Is just, what do you want your city to be like in 2040? And it turns out it's way easier to get everyone on the same page. Everybody wants affordable housing. Everybody wants to address climate change. Everybody wants a better transportation system. And so when you have people agreeing very publicly about those things, you can go out and do your community engagement and basically have more constructive conversations. I'll use an example, is that you might go out in the community and are confronted with someone saying, I don't like these bike lanes. I'm never going to support bike lanes. They totally suck. You're getting rid of my driving lane. I can't go as fast as I want to. And what you can do when you have these goals that everyone has agreed to is you can turn it back on them and say, okay, but we need to address issues like climate change. So would you please tell me how else you would like to achieve that goal? And sometimes what you get is a blank stare. And that's great for your community engagement process, because now they have taken themselves out of your community engagement process, and you can listen to the folks who want to be part of the solution. And so that's how we did coalition building in Minneapolis, around Minneapolis 2040. And we're able to take that next step into, okay, what are we actually going to do? What are the actions we're going to take to achieve those goals?
Yeah, so it's funny, on our prep call on this, we got into the NIMBY YIMBY thing, and of course, I really dislike both terms, and I get it where it's like making a statement about what our values are, what our priorities are, where we're going. So for me, it's on these, there's two things I don't like, and I think that we can change it, and I think that we can do better. I don't think the NIMBYs and YIMBYs argument is helpful, and
Just really fast, it's for anyone who doesn't know what that means. I realized I said it and didn't explain it. It means NIMBY is not in my backyard to new developments, essentially. YIMBY is yes in my backyard.
Yeah, and so I want to say this to Joe, too, before we get going. Minneapolis is a totally different city, 6 times the size of Madison. Therefore, you might have 6 times the talent, not the talent, but, exposure, if you will. It's a big city. But 2 things that as a black woman, that I have to think about is, I don't think the NIMBY YIMBY helps, or because, we are the lowest group of home ownership. If you look at it, it's like 13%. It's totally ridiculous when the country is at maybe 65%. I don't know. These guys will quote me on these numbers. That's wrong. Scratch that. But we are so low, and we want to own homes to develop generational wealth and to continue generational wealth. And then Minneapolis, I don't mind. You guys did DEI, George Floyd happened, and you guys stuck on it. You guys were so hardcore, it was like unbelievable. The country had to say, wow, these guys are not playing around. What I find happens a lot of time is everything is built on DEI, which means it's built on my back. And then when push comes to shove, we start asking, well, how does this affect black people, brown people, the ones that have not had the privilege? And oftentimes, not just, here in Madison, we try to stay to it, but a lot of times it's easy to dump us because we don't have the resources, the time. We're not in the political space. We haven't been planners. We haven't been in city development for for a long time. So it's a new space for us. Even me as an alder, with all that I know, all the connections, all the personal experience that I have had in real estate and development and housing, I am on a high learning curve because I'm going to be the first person to be checked. And that brings us to going into microaggression. So we could be here all night. All of these things add into housing. So I agree with you. I don't think the NIMBY is helpful. I think it should be quashed. I understand that we need to, what you're saying is we need to get people on the same page and say housing is important and we're going to diversify. We have to diversify. What I hear the community saying is, yes, let's diversify, but let's not lose Madison, and let's not have everything look the same where it's a building with red paint, yellow paint, green paint. I'm making up the colors, but.
Yeah, so I would say one of the issues, one of the barriers that comes up is, you speak to like NIMBYism and so on and so forth, is a lot of the language that we use, the longitudes, the latitudes and the masking of words and altering of their meanings in order to actually get people distracted from what we're really talking about. The thing about NIMBYism is it is a real problem, and it really affects and impacts many people, and the majority of people that it impacts are the people that are the lowest on the rung or the ladder, if you will. Those who have the smallest voice or the least amount of access. And so, as irritating as some of these terms can be, it is important that we don't lose what's actually behind the reason why these statements exist, because these are decades and decades and decades of practices and barriers that have been upheld and put forward and then disregarded when it comes to why aren't you able to keep up with your counterparts. The reality is we are all universal. Housing is universal. Even the cat burglar wants a safe place for his grandmother to live. You know what I mean? So it's very universal. So in terms of where we want to go, that's easy to figure out. Where the difference is where we're coming from and where we're at. That's where Madison becomes a tale of two cities. We repeatedly top many of the #1 best lists for good reason. If you are in the best part of the city, if you will, and I do air quotes for part of the city, but not locale, but I mean in terms of like social economic place. But if you're not in the #1 part of the city, you are on the opposite end of the spectrum. There are so many things that divides the community of Madison that is outside of housing. I think housing is just one placeholder that we can put up and everybody can kind of rally around and point to. But the reality of the situation is, for a lot of people in our community, home ownership just isn't a reality. Renting a property isn't a reality. For some people, they are in a better position or closer to owning a home than they are to renting a home, which is outrageous. We have things, it's a business, so we understand that there has to be money made, but there are barriers that are being put in front of potential renters that are just unrealistic. You're renting a unit that is $2,200, you have to make 3 times the annual monthly income. Well, if I make close to $7,000 a month, chances are I'm probably not going to be trying to move in this apartment. I'm probably, if I could actually live, if I actually made that, I would probably be trying to live somewhere else or do something different. And those are the discrepancies that are never really addressed, or at least have not been addressed up until this point. What about those who just go to work every day and keep their heads down and just try to feed their family and do those quote unquote normal things and never engage in the political foray, or have never heard terms like NIMBYism? They don't know anything about the laws or what different programs are doing. Like what do those people do? Like, who speaks for those people? How do those people get involved in the conversation that so drastically impacts them in the way that they live their life and raise their family? And there hasn't been a lot of ways publicly. There's been ways with a lot of different entities from a private standpoint. Drop a shameless plug, Own It, Building Black Wealth, where we have purposely and actively sought out those individuals who have been left out of the conversation, who historically didn't sit around the dinner table having conversations about economics and wealth building and home ownership and entrepreneurship. And we're bringing those individuals to the table, figuring out what it is that they need to be able to feel like they can compete, and then actually putting those plans into action.
And I mean, I think what we hear from city officials often is that the only solution to addressing the housing shortage here is to build more housing. Is that true? Is that the only solution? Is that, I mean, perhaps the most obvious, but
It's an essential part of the solution. You cannot solve the problem without doing that.
But it's not the whole solution. Yeah.
what more is there, I guess? What are, I mean, layers obviously here, but I'm
Yeah, well,
curious.
so I'm better versed in talking about that macro supply, right? But so I'll let others talk more about the how do you reach make housing affordable to somebody who's making, like I say, 60% or 30% of area median income. And basically, if you're talking about new construction, you're talking about massive amounts of money. There just isn't another way to do it. You given the cost of land and materials and labor, the cost of producing any new housing unit is extremely expensive. And so it really has to, it's either you're willing to, from the federal government, from the state government, or from even to the city government, very large pots of money to invest in new housing. That's about the only way to make it affordable.
I mean, I think also you need to define what affordable is, because what's affordable for one very well may not be affordable for the next. And so those solutions don't always, reach everybody that they're intended to. So just really being mindful about, the approaches that we have and who's actually able to take advantage of it.
And that's a key point that we go down with at council. I think one thing that's changing, and by the way, we have the most diverse council in the history of Madison, and I'm going to argue, I don't know, in Minneapolis, you guys have done a good job too, but I think we're a little bit more diverse. If we look at BIPOC, LGBTQ, I think we're like 90%. So, but one of the things is all these acronyms and high-level talk excludes a lot of people from understanding. When we're talking about, the average median income, we're talking like, and don't quote me on these numbers, but then again you can, is like $60,000. So that's like people that work at the city. That's like people that work at the police department. That's like people, graduating from college. And we're not even talking about the people that, if I work at McDonald's, Taco Bell, if I serve you at the airport and my husband works a full-time job, at $15 an hour, you are not living in Madison without assistance, without help, period. If you are talking about minimum wage, your whole household is going to have to be working. When we're talking about kids out of the gate, graduating from college, and they are going to get a 2-bedroom place for $2,200 a month, or studio for $1,100, and it's 200 square feet. I mean, we got a problem. How we're going to solve it, I don't think any of us up here know. Joe's on it. He's been on it, and he's staying on it, and he has this belief, and he's going to change it, right? No doubt. That's serious work. But it is at $450,000 for the average home in Madison. I'm out.
And that's counting existing houses. If you're talking about new construction, it's way higher than 450,000.
Yeah, and I think to the point, or to the question, a lot of the solution, a big part of the solution is in new construction, but a lot of solution is in that existing, in the existing housing that we have, and then allowing those who are at the end or the top of the cycle, if you will, those being those older homeowners who may be widows or widowers, who children are probably adults and maybe have children of their own that are in school or college, and they are in this home that, you know, it may be 2,500 square feet more than they need. You know, they may only need 400 or 500 square feet, and then it's 3,000, 3,200 square foot unit, but they either have their home paid off or they're locked into a mortgage that's extremely low. It doesn't make sense for them to move. A lot of them aren't able to move, so then you're not able to free up that large housing so that the people at the stage up under them can move up and the people up under them can move up and can move up. Because what ultimately happens is those who can afford to move up just end up buying down. And that ultimately pushes those who are supposed to be in that category to the bottom. And once you get to the bottom, it ain't no more. So really a huge part of it is creating a path to allow the cycle to continue without interruption. And we haven't been able to figure out how to do that yet.
And Alder Amani mentioned this. Joe, you're on the case in Minneapolis. I think you all are. But, you know, Minneapolis has, in the past 2 decades, enacted some pretty major housing reform policies that have allowed the city to expand its housing supply pretty significantly and keep rents stable. You mentioned at the beginning that, you know, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and what Madison is experiencing is happening all across the country, as we know. But what can Madison learn from other cities like Minneapolis?
So a few things that Minneapolis has done that we think, and research is starting to show, works, is that you have to make it possible to build housing in a lot more places than you think. You have to have zoning capacity that is far greater than the expected growth that you have in your community. And so just like supply and demand of housing itself, supply and demand of the actual land and the entitlements that come with that is part of the equation. And so that's a big thing that we've done in Minneapolis, is make it possible to increase housing supply and diversity in all parts of the city, and especially in places where markets are really hot, but have historically been limited to single-family home development. And we're starting to see development occur in those areas, and it's mostly on major corridors. We're not talking about apartment buildings, 4 or 6 stories in the middle of single-family neighborhoods. Although we're going to start our planning process again here in a couple of years, so maybe we'll have that conversation. But that's where you have to start. You have to allow it to happen. And you have to allow it to happen in a way where you are not having the conversation about whether development is appropriate on every single project. It's a waste of everyone's time and resources, and it leads to inequitable outcomes. So that's why I started my comments with, get on the same page at the high level so that when you get down to the details of implementation, you're not arguing over every little project. You're just allowing developers to come in and execute the vision that you've all agreed to. Okay, so that's like the big thing, but then there are 1,000 little other things that cities should be doing too, and I know that Madison is doing some of these things. You eliminate your parking requirements. We know that increases housing costs. You need to have programs that support the most affordable housing development. So funding, there needs to be money. Market is not going to produce 30% AMI units, and there's huge demand for them. There's not enough funding nationwide for this, so this is an issue that needs to be tackled at the local, regional, state, and federal government. The other thing I'll mention is that we have programs that we've started at the city of Minneapolis where one example I'll share is we have something called the Developer Technical Assistance Program, where we target folks who are from those communities that are maybe more vulnerable to gentrification or displacement, and bring them along and teach them basically to be developers, give them access to the resources to do that, so that when they are doing wealth building and creation, they're doing it in their communities and they're keeping that cycle happening within their communities. And we just have gotten to the point now where the first cohort that has gone through and has developed their first projects are now mentoring other folks, and so we're really excited about that. But again, it's just one small example out of 100 different things that we should be doing.
If I could jump in on that, I mean, I talked about Madison has made baby steps in the right direction, but Madison still has an extremely complex zoning code that has multiple layers of opportunities to make projects not work economically by cutting off floors, by eliminating units. And so there's a huge amount of risk anytime anybody tries to do any sort of real estate development in Madison because of this. And then even if you can spend the tens of thousands of dollars or over $100,000 or more to get to the point where you get the zoning entitlements, there's a much longer process after that to try to clear off the 100 or more conditions that have been placed on that zoning approval that you have to clear off trying to work with city staff, that again adds cost and adds risk. And so pretty much the only entities that can do real estate development in Madison right now are large organizations with lots of capital and lots of experience, because they're the only ones that can take that risk. So for smaller developers, people who are new to the game, who want to break in and do good work in their neighborhood, I wouldn't recommend them to do it because the risk is just way too great right now.
And can I just say this is the one thing that worries me most. And again, I am so new, I'm just like in study mode. And I am in District 12, and I say that we're 12 and 12 because in District 12, I'll probably have 12 developments in the next
East side, right?
East side and north side. But what worries me the most about this, and this is, I think it's kind of funny because the community complains about the process. They hate it. They feel like they're not informed. The developers complain about the process. They hate it. They feel like they're in paperwork central, and they don't get to talk to the community up front. Then when the community comes in, it's a total disruption to the $1 million that they already laid down into it. So I worry about somewhere along the line, and this is a new thesis for me, I haven't flushed it out, could not be true, is there's trust that was lost. Somewhere, and maybe it was COVID, we didn't get to do all these meetings, I don't know, but trust was lost. And I see the city as a business with like 28 different departments, and I don't understand why we don't run the show. It is our city, and we are going to spend the money somehow. And I know that there's state law and all sorts of factors, but that's why I think we got to bring everybody together. What I loved about the Minneapolis plan, I'm jumping over for a second, is you guys attached to your I think it's 2040 plan, like the goals, and then specifically this goal is manifested here on number 1. This hits number 1, 3, 7, 5, 9, right? So you guys were connecting. We somewhere along the line, we've got to come together, and I think actually Dane County Housing Task Force is going to do it for us. They already did it, coming together where they bring all these different players, just like you have all of us up here, that these little micro differences actually make a difference in how things go. It is not about NIMBY-YIMBY. It's about the micro differences that we can't understand in each other because we haven't experienced it. I couldn't understand homelessness until I lived at Super 8 and I had to go to food pantry and was like, what time is Salvation Army do I need to call? It's a whole different ball game. So that's one of the things that worries. I want it to be city driven, not developer driven, and I don't think they want to drive it, frankly. They want to develop.
Your response, Bill?
No. I mean, what we want is predictability and clarity. Just tell us what you want, where you want it built, and have a clear, predictable process, and we'll deliver.
Yeah, so I think to your point, the city is running it. It has made the decisions. The city just hasn't necessarily always stood on those decisions. They've somewhat vacillated. The developers are just going to do whatever the city's going to tell them to do, to be honest, because they want to a finished product at the end, because that's how they make their money. So the more clear and transparent the city can be in terms of what the expectations are, and who needs to be paid attention to during the process, that's really what's going to dictate it. You can call it whatever you want to, but as long as we continue to build projects, we're going to continue to have projects. As long as you continue to concentrate, the social, economic demographics, you're going to continue to have the issues that we have with places like M Block. If you're not properly spreading out the resources, if you're not properly mixing the different economic levels and the different walks of life in these properties, you're always going to have that disparity.
I just want to jump in and offer another example of how this can work. Is prior to working on Minneapolis 2040, we had a system in Minneapolis where we did a lot of what we call small area plans. And I don't know if you do something similar here. You look at a little district.
Oh yes, we have
okay.
area plans.
Great.
Lots of them.
Oh yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay. So the way we did this analysis before starting Minneapolis 2040. We looked at all of the projects over the previous 10 years that had been proposed within these areas where we did really intense strategic visioning and planning. And projects that came forward in those areas were approved on consent, meaning no discussion at our planning commission or by our city council, at a 90% clip. So to me, it just says if you can do advanced planning in such a way that sets those expectations clearly for everyone at the table, stakeholders, elected officials, appointed officials, and developers, it's possible to do it. Although I heard some grumbling about the small area plans.
I was grumbling. I was one of the grumbling because we have a long history of small area plans, neighborhood plans in Madison. And they tended to be done in areas where the most privileged people lived, and they were plans that served them. And they are still in existence, and they are still obstructing what the larger goal supposedly of Madison is on the housing front.
Yeah, so for folks who don't know, literally just I think 2 weeks ago perhaps, the city council passed the first 2 of 12 perhaps area plans on the west side and the northeast side. And what a process that's been. I've had the privilege of reporting on all of that from, community meetings that were just wild to see, of folks packed into rooms. I guess the hope is, right, that all the tension that happened around both of those plans, because there were pieces of both of those, happen now so that future planning and development, it sounds like, can perhaps occur more smoothly, but maybe I do think there has been criticism that they don't do enough.
Well, I'm sitting up here painting a really rosy picture of Minneapolis too, and I suppose I should admit that if you maybe have seen in the news, we were sued over the Minneapolis 2040 plan by those folks who have had the power and influence in our city for many years, and they were successful in stopping us from implementing it for a couple of years. And the state legislature had to step in and say, no, this is not how we're going to do things. And they basically adopted some laws that stopped the lawsuit. So that's not to say that this just happens easily in other places either. This all sounds really familiar.
But I'm hoping that we're going to find a way to work collaboratively. City council is a lot of work. There's a lot of learning. It's actually, if I could say, it's kind of ridiculous. And what I mean by that is, I'm just going to say it. Our pay is ridiculous. I'm going to say the amount of time that if you want me to make a real decision, you want me to evaluate, like a board of directors, I'm just trying to check to make sure that we're not going off the cliff, then I guess you would teach me how to read your paperwork. I guess you'd teach me what the different acronyms mean in planning and why that's important. I guess you wouldn't just tell me how it goes, and when I ask questions, criticize me or try to minimize me. It is a serious job, And between us and leadership, we are the final decision makers. And I think it's very frustrating for staff and waste a lot of time when we don't know what's going on, because you can't just send me over 500-page report on, and it's no criticism, on Tuesday, and we're going to be voting on it in 10 days, and some of the stuff is complex. I spent 10 years in foreclosure law, right? And I would never just push something through and say, well, this is what it means, and just go with it, because that, you're not going to get to the diversity that you need for the things that you don't need, that you don't know because you haven't been in foreclosure. Because that was another thing in 2008. I went to the mayor at the time and said, oh yeah, your prices are getting ready to go through the roof, because these are in foreclosure. It costs the city. Other small developers, investors are going to come in, flip the house, and they're going to rent them out, Airbnb, then prices are going to go up. And I could see it because I was in it.
Yeah. I just want to move us along a little bit, because I think, it's interesting that all of this comes up and the area plans come up, because I think one of the biggest pieces of perhaps tension in the community, in both communities, but specifically when we look at the West Area Plan, which kind of came up first a little bit in this process, is that, I think folks see new developments popping up all over Madison, right? And, think there's a lot of housing occurring and new development occurring. But it can be kind of polarizing among homeowners. And so I'm curious, Bill, from a development perspective, how do you balance the need for more housing while also this, concern that we've heard a lot in Madison to preserve the character, right, of neighborhoods? How does that happen? Does it happen?
Well, yeah. Well, it's one thing I think it's kind of amusing is that you hear people talking about all these new apartment buildings that are being built, and they say, oh, they all look the same, and they're all ugly, and they're destroying the kind of the sense of place of Madison. And it's like, Madison has an urban design commission where almost all of those large apartment buildings went through an urban design commission, which is supposed to prevent that from happening, and that most communities don't have. And it's an extra layer of bureaucracy, and it's an extra layer of cost, and it's an extra layer of time, and it's an extra layer of risk that keeps newbie developers from getting into the development world. But it didn't satisfy the people who it was supposed to satisfy. So it's like, why are we doing this? But I go back to the idea that we need to maximize new housing production in the places where it makes sense to do that. And Joe mentioned, it might be in a residential neighborhood, but we're only talking about, kind of like the main thoroughfares in there. That's where we should be maximizing. And those usually are kind of like the boundaries between neighborhoods. So if we can start to talk about these fairly narrow strips along major thoroughfares as kind of the opportunity zones to maximize housing, and then do things, the things that we do kind of in the interior of the neighborhoods, not be so threatening to the people who live there, I think we can achieve some level of peace and still meet the housing needs we have.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to try to move through as many of these audience questions as possible. I hope y'all are sticking with us through this. Maybe we can make this rapid fire in some kind of sense, see how fast we can get through some of these. But this is kind of a good overlooking question, a broad question. What is the biggest current limiting factor to the growth in overall housing stock in the city? And how do you address that factor? I'm just going to throw them out there, and whoever wants to take it can.
I would say it would be restrictions to developers, some of the red tape that they have to go through, and not knowing for sure that if what they're being told today is going to be in fact in place tomorrow. And then secondly, as I mentioned earlier, just the lack of skilled labor to actually be able to put in the hours that we need to produce these properties.
Definitely. And then we have a Middleton alderperson here who kind of in a similar vein, or on the contrary to that, says they are faced with developer demands when, I guess, when looking at private property. I guess how can the city promote affordable housing against the developer's desire for profit?
Well, I'll take this because this kind of hits the, separating Madison's crisis from affordable housing crisis, right? Again, this goes back to language and defining things. I really don't think that we should be calling it affordable housing. It's attainable housing, right? Because really, for the what we've hit is we've hit a critical mass in that for the average Joe, right? Madison's housing is unattainable, or we know it's going in that direction. We know that we're going to end up with, if we don't do something about it, we're going to end up with the San Francisco problem, what I call McCarthy's problem, where generations have lived there and they're not going to be able to live in their city. And so I think that's one of the things is kind of getting down into the weeds about affordable versus attainable, because developers look at affordable in a totally different way than, the average person. I think that answers it.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that because the need for housing production is so great because of all the people that are moving into the Dane County area year after year after year. This isn't a problem that the government can somehow solve. The government doesn't have the resources to build housing for everybody. That isn't feasible. So you're going to need massive amounts of capital from private investors, from developers, and from the equity partners that they get to invest in their projects, in addition to having a very robust nonprofit organization seeking capital and investing in it too. But it needs to be all these things together in addition to the government to have a chance of producing enough housing. And developers are never going to not insist on making a profit, okay? They won't invest here. They can go invest other places where they can make a profit. So if you say, well, we got to stop the developers from making a profit and that'll solve the problem, it won't solve the problem. It'll make the problem worse.
And speaking of government involvement and how the government can help with this, perhaps the first question we got this evening before we all even came out here. So thank you to that audience member for coming prepared, knowing what you wanted to ask. What would it take to get rent control in Madison?
I'm smiling because we were downstairs, we got this question, and Ian and I both said almost the exact same thing, is it's maybe the wrong question. I shouldn't have put that out there for you, but that was my reaction. You need to spend some time understanding whether or not rent control is right for your community first. And so there are a lot of places around the country who have done this where rent control helps a small number of people and makes the overall housing market worse. There is a way to thread the needle, but there are, in my understanding, there are very few housing markets in the country that can thread that needle right now. We have, as an example, in Minneapolis, our sister cities across the river in St. Paul, by referendum adopted a very strict rent control policy a couple of years ago, and development has all but completely stopped in St. Paul. So we've studied it in Minneapolis. It's possible that we will adopt a rent control ordinance, but it will be a very light touch if we do.
And I will say it is illegal.
Yeah, in Wisconsin, it violates state law,
yeah,
so you can't do it.
The legislature prohibits it here, so unless...
Yeah, it is unconstitutional, but there again, in 20, and I argued this with, some electeds and some people that, are in the know, but I'm pretty sure because I was in real estate then, I was a landlord, that it's got to be like 2005. Once somebody was in, we could go up like 5%. I do think the apartment association of Central Wisconsin, or whatever their name is, I do think they lobbied to get rid of that, and I do think that they were successful with that. And I do think that adds into the cost going up a bit. What I worry about, and I know everybody on this panel worries about, is where, landlords, rightfully so, because I was a landlord, I was trying to make a profit, I'm not a nonprofit, you can raise people's rents $150, $200, boom, like that. And when you're on the edge, or you're just starting out or whatever, it's your $200, and it makes it very difficult. There is a finite, most people are not independently wealthy. And so everybody will reach a maximum as far as like, that's too much for me. And so we have to be cognizant of that, and who knows? And it's interesting to hear what you're saying about St. Paul put it in and it just killed business. We don't want that either.
Well, yeah, I think it's important. One thing I want to add, I think it's important to look at both sides of the issue, and I'm not advocating more for either or, but the reality of the situation is, with rent control, there is someone else who is impacted, like you say. Being a landlord, or those who invest, that is in some instances removing the incentives. I think one of the misconceptions is that the majority of retailers, if you will, or vendors, so those who are either landlords and are renting apartments or places to live, or the developers that are building these new homes to sell and so on and so forth, are like these cats with these top hats and monocles and just sitting back, figuring out how they can separate people from their money. They're actually very easy to deal with because they're very numbers motivated. Does it make sense? Does this make money for me, or does it not? You can raise rent all you want, but if you raise your rent too much, guess what? Nobody's going to come in. You can raise the price or the cost of doing business and building your product, but if you raise it too much, guess what? You're not going to get business. We are in a particular supply and demand place that allows almost a natural governor to be put on, the builders and the landlords, because the market is going to dictate. Now, obviously, take that with a grain of salt, because there's going to be some variances. But for the most part, the market is going to dictate what those individuals are able to charge. So yes, there are people on the other side that we need to take into consideration that are being priced out. But I don't think that the answer, or necessarily the villain, is the person on the other side of the equation that's trying to make money. They are actually two parts of the same whole. It's really an external factor that is really really mucking the problem up. Those two sides are really on the same team.
But we have an extremely low, vacancy rate, which it has been that way for a very, very long time through several administrations. So that is a problem, coupled with people are coming. And interestingly enough, I digress on what most people think about the growth of Madison, because I actually went back and charted it out 50 years. I think we're about what we've always been. We're a growing city. We've been a growing city for the past 30 years. It goes between, oh Lord, I don't want to say it because the planners are going to get on me. Technically, Latimer Burris, it was 1.5769, and you said 1.6, but somewhere between 1.2.
That was a good impression, yeah.
No, I love you guys. You guys are amazing.
We'll do one more. So in November, Madison voters are going to be asked to approve 3 referendums, 2 for the school district, 1 for the city, that will have a pretty large property tax hike attached to them if they pass. So this question is about how will the size of a potential tax increase affect sorry about that, the affordable housing issue for both homeowners and people who rent.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a cost of doing business if you're own an apartment building, and so you will attempt to pass that on to your tenants. The market conditions will determine whether you're successful in passing that on or not, but it'll be a substantial increase in their operating expenses, and they will attempt to pass it on as increased rent.
Right. As a renter myself, I think I've been, writing about this and been like, I don't own a house. This is not going to affect me. I'm immune to all of this. But I learned pretty quickly that that is probably not the case, which it's glad to have that confirmation now so I
Yeah,
can get my
but
budget in order.
For I'm not quite sure how it works because I don't work in this area, but for those that are Section 42 tax credit programs where the state or agency, there's a state agency that says this is how much you can charge for a 2-bedroom if it is being rented to somebody making 60% of area median income and there's 2 people there or 3, it's complicated, but it's regulated. For those ones that have received those state or federal tax credits, how much they can charge from rent is actually regulated by a state agency, and it varies from there's one set of rents for the Madison area, and there's another set of rents for the Green Bay area, and so on. So I'm not sure that there would be immediate kind of increase in rents for those properties, but at some point in time, it probably would increase rents as well there.
Absolutely. Well, I have one more question, actually. Sorry, guys, and the note cards are going to go everywhere here, but that's okay. And this one is for you, Ian, over here, because I didn't get to this one. But I guess I'm curious about your work with Own It and how you think Madison and city leaders can help Black and brown families build wealth through home ownership.
I'm glad you prefaced that question with the Own It part, because just the last part, how it was originally written, was somewhat loaded, or could potentially be. I think, honestly, the biggest thing that the city can do is to continue to be open, continue to be transparent, and continue to be consistent in what it's doing. Be an advocate, be an ally, help remove barriers. Don't provide barriers, whether it's for builders, developers, renters, homeowners who are renting out their properties, and really take into consideration those voices that are not often represented. What Dane County did with this housing strategic committee was mentioned a little bit earlier. I think taking a note out of what they did, which was really dig deep into bringing stakeholders that represent all walks of life, all demographics, those who are at the very top of the decision-making process, to those who don't even know that decisions are being made, but they're the ones that are being impacted by the decision. That's the way that you actually get to the bottom, and you see what each individual's perception is. I was on that committee. We actually had a mayor in one of the meetings say, we don't have a racial equity problem in housing. Come on now. Where you live at? You don't live where I live. You can't. So just being honest and open about what's really going on, even if you don't really know, and then being able to come to the table, have those questions, establish what is reality, and then you can craft solutions that will help mitigate the problems that Black and brown people face, which is lack of access, which is lack of education, lack of capital, lack of patience from people who are in the industry and know what's going on, but feel like, hey, this is either below my price grade, or I'm not going to get paid enough, or they don't know enough. You just have to really have a desire to want to help these people that you claim when you get in front of the camera that you want to help.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to all of our panelists here. Give them a round of applause.